Well, I suppose somewhere between Associates Gone Wild and sad and boring, this week I found Charlton Heston. Some of you may remember Charlton Heston and his iconic role of Moses in the Ten Commandments. Others of you perhaps are more familiar with the Disney animation version, Prince of Egypt. Both of these movies helped this scripture enter the pop culture world. But if your only familiarity with this story is one of these two movies, or if you haven't heard this story since your childhood days, we better start with a quick refresher. Moses was born to a Hebrew mother in a time when the Hebrew people were enslaved in Egypt. And the Pharaoh had ordered all the Egyptian boys to be thrown into the Nile River. So his mother and sister hatched a plan for Pharaoh's daughter to find Moses. She did, and she took Moses as her son. Fast forward to adult Moses. He sees one of the Egyptians beating one of the Hebrews. So when he thinks no one is looking, he kills the Egyptian. The only problem was someone was looking. And so Moses had to skip town, which brings us to this story of Moses, not yet the great leader of the Hebrew people. This story, Moses is just an outlaw, an exile, a simple shepherd. And this is a story about his call by God, a call he really wasn't certain he wanted or was even capable of. And he basically says to God in this story, "Really? Who, me?" Yes, this is the story of the great leader of the Hebrew people. But when I reread this story a few weeks ago, I realized God's focus in this story really isn't on Moses. It's on the people enslaved in Egypt who were oppressed and crying out to their God for help. They were crying out for someone to speak on their behalf, someone able to bring God's words of peace and maybe a bit of God's justice to their world. Now, maybe that part of the story really jumped out at me when I read it a couple of weeks ago because of all the things that were going on in the news around that time. I went from reading my morning paper about the tremendous strife and the marches in my home state of Missouri, people crying out to God for a little peace and a little bit of justice. And I no more put down my morning paper and I picked up this story in my Bible to find a very similar story. Don't you think? In this story, Moses was just taking care of his livestock when he stopped to inquire about this strange, not really burning up bush. The text says, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called to him. Moses was just busy about his daily activities, but he stopped and noticed. And that was when God spoke, once God had his attention. And that's what this story is really about, I think. God trying to get our attention. A friend of mine, a dear friend, actually in one of our previous congregations, was sitting in my Sunday school class one day, and we were having a conversation about poverty in our community. Long story short, she looks me square in the face and says, "We don't have hungry kids in our community." Well, what followed that comment was a lively discussion about how more than 50% of the kids in our community received free and reduced lunches. And I don't think she was convinced. Until a few months later, when she came into the church office nearly in tears. She had a preschooler who kept showing up to school every day hungry. Through her tears, she looked at us and she said, "We have hungry kids in our community." So I waited for the tears to dry up and asked, "So, what are you going to do about it?" And just like Moses, she sort of answered, "Who, me?" That was it. God had her attention. She had noticed, and that's when God spoke. And since her who me moment, she has spearheaded 2 programs to answer her question. For 7 summers, she has rallied that community to feed kids in the park. Because if they're receiving free and reduced lunch during the school year, what happens to those kids in the summer? During the school year now, they have this program where teachers can slip items on a Friday, food items, into kids' backpacks that they think might need a little something extra over the weekend. All because she was paying attention. And God needs each of us to be paying attention. Just last week, the Old South Church in Boston delivered 1,000 origami peace cranes to Christ the King United Church of Christ in Florissant, Missouri. Christ the King's building has been in the news a lot because it's the site of several community conversations during the protests surrounding the death of Michael Brown. It's where the governor of Missouri met with protesters and community leaders and clergy folk alike. Now, it might seem a little silly to send paper folded like birds into a situation like that, but these small paper birds represent something more. They symbolize a community of believers sharing with a very different community the love and peace and hope of their common Creator. They represent one community saying to another, "We are with you. We are sending our love and prayers because we understand the pain involved when you find the community around you disintegrating into total chaos." The folks at Old South understood because they had received those same cranes after the Boston bombing in 2013. They were a gift from Newtown UCC in Newtown, Connecticut, who had received those cranes after the Sandy Hook school shooting. You see, these colorful paper birds are one community reaching out to send a little love and a little light into a place of great darkness. The folks in Newtown had no connection to the folks in Ferguson, and the folks in Ferguson had no real connection to the folks in Boston, except for one thing. They'd been there. They knew what it was like to cry out, and for someone to speak words of support and hope and love. They knew those birds were more than pieces of folded paper. They knew someone was paying attention. And paying attention to God and what God is trying to do in the world is what it means to be a person of faith and a community of faith. And I want to pay attention. And I want to be a part of a community that is paying attention. And I honestly try. And I don't know about you, but sometimes, y'all, I'm just overwhelmed I hear so many of God's children crying. The internet and the 24-hour news cycle have made the world so very small. And now, more than at any other time in human history, we know about the suffering of the human family. But where do I even start? How do I even start? I'm just one little person. We're just one little congregation. Can we really make a difference? And I think sometimes we get paralyzed by all the possibilities. And in moments like that, I'm challenged by the words of author Wendell Berry, who reminds me that the only little thing that has solved a big problem are a lot of, okay, now I screwed it up. Rewind. Let's start over. And in moments like that, I'm challenged by the words of the author Wendell Berry, who reminds me that the only thing that has solved a big problem are a million little answers or 1,000 paper cranes. In some ways, the documentary Girl Rising was a burning bush moment for our congregation. After viewing that film, so many of you asked, how do we help? And that led Ryan and the outreach team to looking at our partners at Church World Service, which led to the Wine to Water event that raised money for wells in girls' schools around the world. God got your attention. You saw a burning bush and you stopped and you noticed and you did something. And last week, we sent a check for $4,000 to Church World Service. That's 4 wells. That's 4 communities with greater access to clean water because of you. You see, this Bible story that we read this morning isn't just the story of Moses. This is our story too. It's the story of our life of faith, a faith that is paying attention to God, realizing God is trying to do something in the world and God needs our help. And it happens one person at a time, one community at a time, sharing God's love and hope through sack lunches and folded paper birds and even a glass of wine. Amen.